Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing delayed sword and some relationships between it and some other techniques in the American Kenpo system. So the thing to keep in mind about this video and all these videos in this series is that it's really not designed to be a comprehensive list through, say, something like family groupings. It's more an exploration into different ways in which you can move from one technique to another technique, therefore drawing a thread between them and how to do that, and exploring different avenues in which to do that. So as we go through this video, you're going to notice we're going to cover a couple different ways in which you can draw these threads between these techniques. They're not necessarily designed to be showing you that they're the exact same thing, but they may employ something like the same strategy or the same reasoning behind them, okay? So before we get going into these relationships, let's talk a little bit about history, since delayed sword is part of yellow belt. Yellow belt, believe it or not, were the last techniques created in the system, not the first. And the idea was to create this introductory course that the beginner could then take to give them an introduction into Kenpo. So part of the idea of that, or the design of it, was to get the beginner up and going as fast as possible, so they can go, this is really cool, I like this, I'm going to keep going and continue on with the rest of the system. So one of the ideas that this relies upon is the idea of getting them up and going as fast as possible is this quadrilateral zone theory. So the quadrilateral zone theory is basically dividing your opponent and yourself up into these 4 zones by drawing a vertical center line and a horizontal center line. And that gives us those 4 zones. So let's talk through how this yellow belt does that. And this brings us in our first relationship. And this relationship would be through this quadrilateral zone, rather than through the exact same ideas or concepts. So they're grabbing us. We're doing this applied minor here. Applied meaning it's already made it to us. Minor meaning they're not trying to hurt us. So we step back, we do this idea, this strategy, and we'll get into that in just a little bit, and then we go forward. So that picks up this upper left. So then now they go to this punch, and this upper right, and we employ that same strategy. Okay, so now we've filled up the top, so now let's defend our bottom half. So we have something like an intellectual departure, or with the hands up, we do something like a deflecting hammer. So if you look at that, we've got those 4 techniques that are related through this quadrilateral zone, or how to get you up and going as fast as possible to defend those 4 zones, okay? So let's move on to the type of attack. So the type of attack, like you said, the ideal phase is this applied minor, but there's different ways in which they can do it. There's 4. It's based upon intent, and it's based upon timing. So in this case, we did applied, meaning they were grabbing us, they already made it to us, but if we change the timing, it could be it's on its way to us, okay? So that would be in flight. So we have applied and in flight. So then the intent would be they grab us, it's a minor, meaning they're not really trying to hurt us, or they're trying to hurt us, which would be a major, okay? So that you have 4 different situations based upon that. So let's take this and apply it to delayed sword. So delayed sword, they can do this applied minor, which is the ideal phase, and then we're employing this strategy of we're between the hands, so we're going to control that height zone with the kick and then chop them to counter on them. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of this series, which would be, let's go to an in-flight minor. So we could do, guess what? Delayed sword. So let's do that one more time so you can see it. Same idea, same everything, right? So let's take it to an in-flight major. Okay, guess what? We can do delayed sword yet again. And let's go to an applied major, which would be something like this. Okay, and guess what? We can do delayed sword again. So we really haven't related it to anything else, but what we did was expose a specific characteristic of delayed sword, and that characteristic is that it is a master key technique. So what that means is that this technique can be done in a variety of different situations without any change. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's move on to yet another way of thinking about this. So that would be our environment and how it affects what we're doing. Okay, so if we look at the environment, and by the way, environment is defined as anything in, on, or around me. So that would include, the around me would include my partner, or things like walls and floors and sky and oxygen, things like that. So how does that affect us? So let's apply this to where up to now we've been obeying rule number 1, which is establish that base and then control that height zone and then counter. But notice I was able to step back. If I close this environment off, what happens? I'm forced to step forward. So we do things for one of two reasons. Either we have to, meaning compelled to, or we want to, or meaning we're being purposeful in our action. So in this case, we may start out with a grab for a delayed sword, and we think we're going to step back and do delayed sword, but we can't. So what we have to do is we have to step forward in this case. So what we would do is we can try to employ that exact same strategy of what we were talking about, controlling that center line, but we can now do it with our hand instead of our foot and go directly into it. Because if we try and do delayed sword like this, it's really not going to work because we're jammed. So we're forced to move on to something else, but still use that same strategy of setting him back. But now instead of making him bend forward, we're making him bend back. So that works for that. How about that in-flight minor? So we go, guess what? We can do the exact same thing that we did. We can do that trigger salute employing that exact same strategy. So let's take it to the in-flight major, okay? So guess what? I could have stepped back in this case, but if we're taking that environment or situation, remember, it's anything in, on, or around you. So in this case, we use the wall. That would force us to step forward, but there's also them. They could be really close, which forces us to step back, or they could be at a farther distance, which then forces us to step forward, okay? So, and keep in mind, we're back in that same situation of delayed sword, so we step forward or back and we do this initial block. We could, guess what, continue to go with delayed sword, or we could change that strategy up and employ it differently like we did with triggered salute, but now do it differently. So instead of doing the push this way, we're doing the push this way, and then forcing them to bend backwards and forward, okay, which gets us into 5 sword. So if you'll notice, we're trying to employ the same strategy, but things like environment dictate what we have to do, either because it's purposeful because we want to, in this case we chose to use the hand rather than the foot, or the environment dictates to us. The opponent is farther away or the opponent is closer, or we have a wall, okay? So that's, I know we've done a lot, but let's do one more thing. So let's talk about the timing of what's going on here. So we start out with this, let's say the in-flight major. So we get to here and we go, okay, we're going to do delayed sword, but what happens? They might throw another strike. We go, uh-oh, what do we have to do here? Just as in the environment, they've now thrown a backup strike, so we can no longer do this delayed sword or 5 sword thing. So what do we have to do? We have to go into sword of destruction. Okay, so again, sword of destruction, as we brought in earlier, can now be brought in for a completely different purpose. In this case, because a person threw that left. So we're still employing that exact same strategy, that strategy being we're between the hands, so we have to control that height zone. But we can then say, we can choose to do it differently, like we did earlier with 5 swords. So how you could do that is through this. I'm doing similar to what we just did with triggered salute. Same strategy, but now with that backhand controlling them. You go, wow, that's kind of cool. But what happens if it's switched? Let's say it's a left-right rather than right-left. Again, we start with that delayed sword, but then they throw that, and we go, interesting. Can we use this same strategy again? Yes, we can. We now pull them into this, which gets us into the twine maces part. Okay? So just to review that real quick one more time, one is between, one is outside this way, employing that exact same strategy. The other one is between, employing that exact same strategy. Okay? So this is enough for this video, so let's do a quick recap. If you notice, we changed the timing, we talked about the environment, how it affects everything, and then we talked about the different strategy, using that same strategy and the different options we can use, and then we brought that all the way back into minors, majors, applied versus in flight, and then we talked about the quadrilateral zone theory. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.